We've covered the psychology behind death hoaxes and some of the most successful schemes in history. Now, we need to talk about the cases that are still mysteries. The lasting impact of these deceptions and what they tell us about human nature itself. Let me start with the fake death that has generated more conspiracy theories than any other: Adolf Hitler. The official story is that Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945, and that his body was burned to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But here's the problem. The Soviets never found definitive remains. And for decades afterward, there were reports of Hitler sightings in South America. The FBI files on Hitler contain hundreds of reports from the 1940s and 1950s, describing sightings in Argentina, Chile, and other South American countries. Some of these reports came from credible sources, including intelligence operatives and former Nazi officials. The physical descriptions often matched Hitler, and several witnesses claimed to have seen him living under assumed names in remote areas. Now, most historians believe Hitler really did die in Berlin. The evidence for his suicide is strong, and he was too recognizable to disappear successfully. The fact that people were willing to believe he had escaped shows you the power of the fake death narrative. When someone is that hated and feared, people need to believe they're really gone. The uncertainty about Hitler's death fed conspiracy theories for decades. But let me tell you about a case where the evidence for fake death is actually pretty compelling. Jim Morrison of The Doors. Morrison supposedly died in Paris in 1971 of heart failure. But here's what's suspicious. No autopsy was performed, only 3 people saw the body. And Morrison had been talking about disappearing and starting a new life for months before his death. Morrison was facing serious legal problems in the United States, including possible prison time for indecent exposure charges. He had moved to Paris partly to escape these issues, and he had become obsessed with the idea of disappearing from public life. His girlfriend Pamela Courson was the only one who claimed to have found his body, and she gave conflicting accounts of what happened. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but this was based entirely on the testimony of Courson and a French doctor who never actually examined the body. Morrison was buried quickly in a sealed coffin, and French authorities accepted the explanation without investigation. For someone who had been talking about faking his death and disappearing, the circumstances were suspiciously convenient. There have been numerous Morrison sightings over the decades, and some of them are hard to dismiss. People who knew him well claim to have seen him in various locations, often looking older and heavier, but unmistakably Morrison. The fact that he was a poet and intellectual who spoke French fluently would have made it easier for him to disappear in Paris than it would be for most American celebrities. Now here's what really gets me about these fake death cases. They reveal how much of history is based on incomplete information and the testimony of people who had reasons to lie. We accept the official stories about historical deaths because we trust the sources, but those sources often had political, financial, or personal motivations to deceive us. Take the case of Amelia Earhart, who disappeared over the Pacific in 1937. The official story is that she crashed and died. But there's substantial evidence that she might have survived and been captured by the Japanese. For decades, the U.S. government insisted she was dead. But recently declassified documents suggest they knew more about her fate than they admitted. Several witnesses claim to have seen Earhart alive in Japanese custody, and some evidence suggests she might have been held as a prisoner for years after her disappearance. If this is true, then her death was essentially faked by the U.S. government, which found it politically convenient to let the world believe she had died, rather than admit she had been captured while on a possible intelligence mission. The psychology of believing in fake deaths tells us a lot about human nature. We want to believe that our heroes don't really die, that our enemies get their comeuppance, and that there's always more to the story than what we're told. Death narratives give us a sense of control over mortality and an explanation for things that don't make sense. But here's the dark side of fake death obsession. It can prevent us from accepting reality and moving on. The families of people who supposedly faked their deaths often spend decades and fortunes searching for someone who was actually dead. The conspiracy theories surrounding fake deaths can become more important to people than the truth, leading to elaborate fantasies that substitute for genuine grief and acceptance. Modern technology has made traditional fake deaths nearly impossible. DNA testing, digital records, surveillance cameras, and biometric identification make it incredibly difficult to disappear completely and start a new life. The last successful fake death by a major public figure was probably in the 1970s or 1980s, before computers made identity verification routine. But here's what's fascinating. Even with modern technology, people still want to believe in fake deaths. The conspiracy theories about celebrities like Tupac, Elvis, and Michael Jackson show that the psychological need for these narratives hasn't disappeared. We still can't accept that talented, famous, or beloved people are subject to the same mortality as everyone else. The internet has made fake death theories spread faster and persist longer than ever before. What used to be whispered rumors in small communities now become global conspiracy movements with millions of believers. The democratization of information has made it easier to find evidence for any theory you want to believe, no matter how implausible. Looking back at the historical cases we've covered, what strikes me is how many of them involved people who were facing impossible situations: execution, disgrace, capture by enemies, or political collapse. Faking death wasn't usually about escaping minor problems. It was about escaping situations where actual death was the likely alternative. The successful fake deaths required three things: resources, loyal accomplices, and circumstances that made verification difficult. Without all three, the schemes failed quickly. This is why most fake deaths in history involve royalty, wealthy individuals, or people with access to intelligence networks and criminal organizations. But perhaps the most important lesson from these historical fake deaths is that identity itself is more fluid than we like to admit. In societies without modern documentation and verification systems, you could literally become someone else by convincing enough people that you were who you claimed to be. The fake death schemes that worked didn't just fool people about whether someone was dead. They fooled people about who they actually were. The legacy of historical fake deaths extends beyond the individual cases to influence how we think about truth, identity, and mortality itself. These stories remind us that official historical narratives are often incomplete, that powerful people have always had ways to escape, consequences that ordinary people don't, and that the line between fact and fiction is sometimes thinner than we'd like to believe. In the end, whether these historical figures really faked their deaths or not matters less than what their stories tell us about human nature. We are creatures who cannot accept that death is final, that heroes are mortal, and that there isn't always a hidden explanation for the things that trouble us. The fake death narrative gives us a way to believe that there's always more to the story, that death isn't really the end, and that with enough cleverness and resources, even mortality can be defeated. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the shadowy world of fake deaths and hidden identities. These stories remind us that history is written by the survivors, and sometimes the survivors are people who were supposed to be dead.